Chapter 4, Section 1. Our Ancestors' Genetic Emotions. Genetic information means that we have all inherited through our genes information from our ancestors, passed on through each generation of children born. However, this genetic information is almost unrecognizable, and this is why many of our ego emotions are not able to accept evolution as a natural phenomenon, because it's almost impossible for us to recognize these genetic changes within ourselves. But these genetic adaptations have been happening in our bodies and our brains, passed on and inherited through each generation of offspring born through thousands of generations. But because of its invisibility, many of our ego emotions think that it's almost inconceivable that all of our past ancestors are part of our present human behaviours today. But there is now modern scientific evidence that provides us all with a basic explanation of how DNA has become the building blocks of our human lives, and all species of life, for all that belongs to our vulnerable and fragile planet Earth. And this is how we have all stored some of our ancient ancestors' genetic emotions that have been passed on to us all through our genes and through each generation, inherited from many of our ancestors' emotional events, and that date back millions of years, that have become stored in certain areas in our brain. We all have our ancestors' genetic emotions, including myself, but differ slightly in size depending on our gender, as you are about to discover throughout these next few chapters. However, because there are many that still, even in our modern world today, do not recognize genetic adaptation as a fundamental principle of how our lives exist at all, we need to spend this very small chapter trying to explain this natural phenomenon that, by the way, was all created through the great universal law of nature. In the early 1800s, Charles Darwin, an English naturalist, geologist and biologist, became the most important person throughout all of human history for his contributions to the science of evolution, and this all still stands even in our modern world today. Darwin was convinced that traits were passed on from generation to generation, and although Darwin knew that the origin of all species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life occurred, he didn't know how. However, modern-day scientists now know the sequence of 4 chemical building blocks of DNA determine the traits of all living things. Each generation passes on this text of A's, T's, C's and G's to its offspring, but occasional mistakes in copy, called mutations or genetic variations, can result in new traits. This is why genetics, in general, is a subject that is fairly difficult for us to get our heads around, because as humans, we just can't see the physical changes that are happening within us. But our ancestors' genetic emotions have been involving certain areas in our brain for millions of years. So far, throughout the first half of this book, we have discussed how we have all developed, including all of our ancestors, some of our own individual and different personal emotions and behaviours, and how most of our personal ego emotions have developed to become some of the most highly influential of all of our emotions and behaviours for reasons that we have already explained in the last few chapters. These ego emotions and behaviours were personal only to our own individual, personal, emotional history of self and our own individual, personal lives since early childhood. But now, in this next few chapters, we are going to discuss some of our genetic emotions and behaviours that we have all inherited through our genes and through certain emotional information inherited from our ancestors, and that we will all also pass on to any of our offspring born. Genetics explains how all past life here on earth evolved and is still continuing to evolve all life here on earth, including all of our human lives, because genetics has shaped our evolution throughout millions of years into who we all are today. We all hurry along with our lives, with all the distractions of life, and at such a fast rate of speed that we are not even aware that whatever our ancestors have experienced in past history is evolving our present internal genetic makeup and has developed many different areas in our brains and bodies. Therefore, our ancestors are partly responsible for the direction of our present and future evolution. But we are all also responsible for the direction of our present and future evolution. Therefore, we must all ask ourselves this very important question: in what direction are we collectively evolving as humans? We have already explained some of these answers throughout the last few chapters, but to get the complete picture, we need to have the courage and persevere to complete the rest of this book. It's extremely hard for us to recognise how many thousands of different species of life here on earth had to continue to adapt in order to survive, and how many species of life still exist on our earth many hundreds of thousands, even millions of years later. A very good example of this evolutionary process can be found through the very ancient monkey puzzle tree that has survived on earth and that dates back as far as millions of years before man ever even existed here on earth. This small example of the ancient monkey puzzle tree that we are going to discuss shortly may help us to understand how most species of life has to adapt in order to continue to survive as a species. And this may also help us to explain how our own human species began to adapt to new environments millions of years ago to evolve into the very first simple humans. But compared to the evolution of other species of life here on earth, for instance, compared to the evolution of this very ancient monkey puzzle tree, we are a very young species, as you will discover shortly. This is why the evolution of all life here on earth takes many millions of years to adapt their individual genes, and this is the reason that many of our ancestors' emotions and behaviours have motivated and influenced our genes to become steered in one particular direction throughout many millions of years, as you will discover shortly. This is why adaptation to new environments through genetic information in order to survive has influenced all individual species of life here on earth, including our own human lives. So here is the incredible story of this very ancient monkey puzzle tree. When I was a young girl, I grew up in a very harsh and exposed climate next to the North Sea in England that was mostly isolated, cold, and very unspoilt. At that time, in my early childhood, the main industry that gave families a secure income and livelihood was fish. The fishing trawlers would go out early each morning, cast their nets into the dark brown, rough cold oceans of the North Sea, and bring back home tons of fresh cod and haddock, ready to be frozen and distributed all over the hungry island. The fishing industry is now no more, and the town has had to find new means to survive and support itself. One weekend in my very early childhood, my family decided to go on a trip to the coast. We set off on one of our Sunday family outings to walk along the beaches of a small fishing town a few miles down the coast. We took our 2 family dogs to the beach, down the steep slopes to explore the small rock pools filled with life, small crabs, limpets, seaweed, etc. It was fun and a great adventure to explore the small pools, as most children love to do when they are children. My parents, myself, and my 3 siblings were happily walking along the beach, playing with the dogs, when suddenly I found my mind drifting down towards the surface of the sand. I sensed that there was something very special at my feet, and there in front of me, half buried beneath the sand, was a large piece of deep black rock. I picked up this black, smooth, glossy rock, the size of my hand, and stared at it for a few minutes. It felt warm to touch and had one flat surface, and the rest like the shape of a hilltop. I had no idea at this very young age what this was, and even more so, I had no idea that this small, dark black geological structure would have such a huge significant impact on my life in the future. Everyone in the family huddled around and started to get quite excited. It was a great find. I carried it around with me all day, feeling very proud to have discovered this small, important piece of semi-precious black stone, unaware of what I was holding in my hand, and unaware that half a lifetime later I would find that this would be the first clue and evidence to explain how all life here on earth evolved. And although I carried that beautiful, small, smooth, mystery gemstone around with me for half my lifetime, I really didn't know much about it until I began to dig into its history. And once I did, this information gave me a huge insight into our planet's evolutionary history and proved just how incredibly old our Earth really is, and how all life on Earth has been astonishingly slow at evolving, but has continued throughout an enormously long period of time. This little piece of black gemstone was called jet and dates back to its development around 182 million years ago. And this began to make me realise the enormity of the age of all life here on Earth, that I had not since this time bothered to care about. I began to research the history of the first life here on Earth, that began the very first, very simple plant life forms to evolve approximately 3,000 million years ago. However, this small piece of jet first began its life around 182 million years ago, and astonishingly, this very first humans only began our own very first, very simple human life around 7 million years ago. This puts the beginning of our own human evolution into perspective, because genetics explains how we are some of the most recently evolved species of life here on Earth. However, as you are about to discover shortly, most species of life here on Earth, including our own human life, had to go through a process of adapting to new environments in order to survive or not adapt and go extinct. For instance, if a certain species up to a certain point had only lived on a food source of, for instance, nuts, but that specific area that nuts grew suddenly had drought conditions and ran out of water one day, so that the nuts couldn't grow in that area any longer, then this particular species would have to do 3 of the following things: starve to death and go extinct, relocate to another area, which is new environments, to find new food, source of new nuts or new foods somewhere else, or find an alternative food source in order to survive. However, in this process of survival, this would put a huge emotional strain on this particular species to adapt its genes so that the new offspring would begin to seek out new alternative food sources, such as altering its digestive choices to eat seeds or berries instead of nuts, for example. This is how genetic adaptation or genetic variation has continued in most species of life throughout many millions of years, because evolution is the process by which all populations of individual species may need to change over many generations, or as rapidly as one generation, depending on the species and its need for survival. And genetic variations underlie these changes, also called mutations. And just like some recent independent evolutionary research studies concerning wild mice found in Nebraska's sandhills that we are going to discuss shortly, genetic variation also alters gene activity or protein function and can introduce different traits into a species. And if the new trait is advantageous and helps the individual species to survive and reproduce, this genetic variation is more likely to be passed on to the next generation of offspring born. And this is a process known as natural selection. And as many generations of individuals with this new trait continue to reproduce, the advantageous trait will become increasingly common in a population of mice, for example, making the population different than its ancestral one. And sometimes the population becomes so different that it is considered a new species. But not all variants influence evolution. Only hereditary variants that occur in the egg or sperm cells can be passed on to future generations and will potentially contribute to the evolution of a species. However, some species just simply couldn't adapt to survive and therefore, for many different reasons, would go extinct. This is a very simplified version of the evolution of all species of life here on Earth, and each individual species has had its own individual struggles to survive, mainly based on the environment or the food source that it has available. But because there are millions of different species of life that has evolved here on planet Earth, it's extremely difficult to tell the story and evolutionary history of each individual species. Therefore, these small examples will have to do. However, you can make your own research in your own time with the help from the index at the back of this book. A very good example of genetic variation can be found through, as we mentioned, through independent research of a particular species of wild mice found living in a specific area in the hot brown soils of the desert in Nebraska's sandhills that had to adapt to new environments in order to survive, because many of the raptor birds were easily spotting the wild mice walking around on the dark brown soils of the desert and swooping down to catch the whiter coloured mice for their supper. And so scientists discovered that the white mice began to genetically adapt its genes to change the colour of its white fur into brown fur, so that the brown mice would become camouflaged into the brown soils of the desert and be spared from many of the raptor birds spotting them. This research showed that genetic variations can be more or less instant whereas in many different species of life, it can take many thousands of years. And this is why genetics can be so confusing to most of us, because genetic adaptation or genetic variation is invisible, and therefore it is a very unrecognisable natural evolutionary process. This is why these very ancient monkey puzzle trees are a very special species of tree, because it has kept its same hereditary genome as a tree species for over 182 million years. However, it has developed effective adaptations to survive disturbances such as volcanoes, fires, wind and landslides, but also more recently, humans induced pressures such as grazing, burning and harvesting for both timber and seeds. This is why the monkey puzzle tree species has been classified under the IUCN guidelines as a vulnerable endangered species, as is currently protected in both Chile and Argentina, and internationally through international trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora, CITES. But to help us all get our heads around these mind-blowing evolutionary facts about the age of the monkey puzzle tree, you can find in the index some more recent independent scientific research studies that identified this genetic variation. Also, information found through several independent scientific references sources, such as jet is a type of lignite, a precursor to coal, and is a gemstone. Jet is not a mineral, but rather a mineraloid. It has an organic origin, being derived from wood that has decayed under extreme pressure. The origin of jet is a product of high-pressure decomposition of wood from millions of years ago, commonly the wood of trees of the family Araucariaceae. Jet is found in two forms, hard and soft. Hard jet is the result of carbon compression and salt water. Soft jet is the result of carbon compression and fresh water. The jet found in England is of early Jurassic torsion age, approximately 182 million years old. Jet is the fossilized wood from species similar to the extant Chile pine or monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria araucana. This is how this small piece of black jet, picked up on that cold, windswept beach, first began its life as the monkey puzzle tree species more than 182 million years ago. And this same species of monkey puzzle tree still exists throughout our world today, in many forests and even in many of our gardens. This is an ancient tree and shows how very old this particular species of tree has retained the same hereditary genetic material for more than 182 million years. However, many millions of other species of life, including our own human life, also had to find new ways to adapt to new environments in order to survive or not adapt and go extinct. So how did all humans begin to genetically adapt? You will have to wait until we begin the next few chapters to discover these more detailed answers, because first we need to attempt to explain how extremely slow and unrecognisable each generation passes on this genetic information to each offspring born by providing you with a very simplified scenario found below. Imagine, just for a few minutes, that you are walking barefoot on a fine stretch of golden beach, with the gentle waves washing the clear emerald and blue sea mineral waters soaking and splashing in between your toes and feet. The beach closest to the shoreline is full of smooth multicoloured pebbles, but the other half of the beach behind you is full of fine, untouched, white, clean grains of sand. You now sit down on that part of the beach, closest to the shoreline. You relax and become aware of the waves moving slowly in and out, in and out. And as you are sitting there, slowly watching and listening to the waves slowly lapping on the shoreline, therapeutically relaxing your mind and your body, you begin to watch and listen to the pebbles on the shoreline rolling in and out, with each wave movement. The pebbles are making a lovely soft rolling noise as they are being pushed in and out by the gentle tidal waves. While you are sitting on that beach, you suddenly take the time to look behind you, and all you can see on the beach behind you is pure, clean, golden white sand, tiny fine grains of pure, soft white sand. You now look again at all of the pebbles slowly washing in and out by the sea's waves. And now you begin to focus your eyes on the particular pebble, on one particular pebble. And every wave is rolling that one particular pebble in and out, in and out. And each time the ocean's waves roll that particular pebble in and out, the waves are very slowly degrading that pebble and eroding that particular pebble very, very, very slowly through the passage of time. But because it is such a very slow process, you cannot see this happening with your naked eye. But you look at this particular pebble and you ask yourself, I wonder how long it would take for that particular pebble to turn into small grains of sand, similar to the small grains of sand that are on the beach behind me. And then you realise that by assessing the movement of the sea's waves, it would take thousands of years to turn that one particular pebble into tiny golden grains of sand on this beach behind you. In other words, this particular pebble would not be worn down and eroded into small grains of sand in your own lifetime, or even one of your father's or mother's lifetime, not even your grandparents' lifetime, or even your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents' past lifetimes, but thousands of generations of your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents' past lifetimes. Therefore, if we equate this same scenario to how long it has taken for each generation of our ancestors to have passed on to us all some of their ancient ancestors' genetic emotions through all of the different past emotional events that our ancestors have continued to experience with each other throughout our human history, this is how our genes have evolved certain areas in our brain, and this also is why some areas in our brain differ slightly in size depending on our gender. This is the reason that the general meaning of genetics is complex, because it is an evolutionary process that is almost invisible to all us humans, and that is why many of us can't understand how genetics has created us all into the humans we all are today. This is when we might ask ourselves, how did these genetic internal structures begin to evolve in certain areas in our brain? As the great Charles Darwin tried to explain to us so many years ago, one small gene variation takes thousands of years to make small changes to occur to all living beings. Therefore, each generation of our ancient ancestors' emotional events have been evolving some of these areas in our brain for many thousands of years. In fact, it first began approximately 7 million years ago. So how did these genetic variations initially begin? Throughout millions of years, there had to be a drastic motion or a severe push of emotional energy in one particular direction in order to transform or transmute our human brain's development. In fact, this is the case for all species of life here on Earth, because nothing stands still. All life here on Earth is evolving towards its own extinction or its own evolution. Therefore, we need to ask ourselves with courage what drastic motion or severe push of energy continued to happen throughout the past millions of years, strong enough to create this slight genetic growth in some particular genetic areas in our human brain. We all hurry along with our lives with all of the distractions of life and at such a fast rate of speed that we are not even aware that whatever we are doing is evolving us and the future for all of humanity for generations to come, because this evolutionary development already began with all of these emotional events of all our past ancestors. Charles Darwin first discussed his theory of evolution by natural selection as an explanation for adaptation, and he defined natural selection as a principle by which each slight variation of a trait, if useful, is preserved, and describes his theory of evolution by natural selection as the process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable, physical, or behavioural traits. More recent scientific studies have now identified that all species of life all hold their own special genetic imprint or encodes that scientists call a species genome. So what is a genome? A genome is the whole of a species' hereditary information encoded in its DNA. In other words, a genome is simply the sum total of a species' DNA. All humans also have our own unique genome, and somewhere in that genome is the genetic imprint given to us by our ancestors' emotions, as we will discover shortly. All individual species' genomes are a reproducible function of sequence for each species that satisfies specific needs or helps to achieve vital goals, and we humans are no exception to this rule. A genome is each species' informational carrier that plays a role in the information that we carry within our genes and ensures that the preservation of various functions. And this is how, within our own human genome, we all carry our own ancient ancestors' genetic emotions. The genetic emotions, that is the genetic information passed on through our ancestors' genes, and that continues us on the same pattern of emotional behaviours as our ancestors. We must pay enormous attention to the role of our ancestors' genetic imprint and the past history of our ancestors' emotions that dates back millions of years, because in this next few chapters we are going to discuss how our ancestors have transmitted specific emotions through their genes, through the very different male and female emotional events that our ancestors have gone through throughout thousands of years of our human history, because this emotional information has become stored in certain areas in our brain and differs slightly in size depending on our gender. In other words, you are about to discover what genetic emotions your ancestors have passed on to you through your genes that will have influenced the development in certain areas in your brain. Independent scientists refer to this as our epigenetic memory that can be given to us either through cellular memory, transcriptional memory, or transgenerational memory. Epigenetics controls genes. This is achieved through either A. Nature. Epigenetics is what determines a cell's specialization. For example, skin cells, blood cells, hair cells, liver cells, etc. As a fetus develops into a baby through gene expression that is either active or silencing dormant. And B. Nurture. Environmental stimuli can also cause genes to be turned off or turned on. However, you will find almost no independent scientific research studies concerning the connection between our ancestors' genetic emotions and behaviours and the genetic development in certain areas in our human brain. This is why the following information throughout these next few chapters is by no means the end of these discussions. There is still a great deal more that we simply do not yet know about ourselves. Therefore, we are all going to need to have a great deal of courage and bravery, just like our ancestors, while reading throughout these next few chapters, because as you are about to discover shortly, we have all inherited our ancient ancestors' emotional information passed down through our parents and through each generation through our genes, inherited from the thousands of years of all of our ancestors' different emotional events and all of the different emotional struggles and suffering that many of our ancestors have experienced with each other throughout thousands of years of our human history. But it's extremely difficult for all of us to imagine that some areas in our brain, depending on our gender, have become very slightly genetically enlarged throughout each generation because of the past history of our ancestors' different emotional events with each other, because we literally cannot see or identify that this has been happening. We cannot understand that throughout thousands of years, our ancestors have been slightly genetically increasing certain areas in our brain. It is something that is almost beyond our reason. However, once we get to the next few chapters of this book, I hope that we will all begin to understand that unless we begin to learn by our ancestors' past mistakes with each other, we will continue repeating the same mistakes in all future generations to come. But why should we all be held back from a positive and peaceful new future with each other because we simply don't know enough about ourselves? We don't deserve this. Throughout mankind's evolution, most of our ancestors have gone through so much fear, struggles and suffering. It's now time to find new solutions to live and survive together with each other. And this is why these new solutions are going to be discussed throughout the second half of this book, section 2. But we can all find clues to these new solutions through some of these outstanding evolutionary theories that Charles Darwin explained to us all so many years ago, but also through some brand new theories for us all to begin to adapt to new environments in order to find new ways to live and survive together with each other. This is why we are going to discuss these theories in the second half of this book. If we each took a few moments of time to stand still, alone, just for a few minutes out of our busy, hectic lives, and went somewhere very quiet, very peaceful, and very silent, away from all of the noise pollution and all of the hustle and bustle of our busy, scheduled daily lives, just for a few moments. And we walked somewhere in the peaceful and silent open nature, full of trees, mountains, fields, rivers, or streams, with not a soul in sight, not a car, not a person, just ourselves and the nature. And we stood still, just for a few minutes, in the peace and silence, and we looked around us, and we began to focus all of our attention, just for a few minutes, say for instance, on one small blade of grass, or one wild flower, or one single tree. And we stopped, and we stared, and we focused our attention on that one small part of nature. We would never ever be able to see any growth occurring on that blade of grass, that wild flower, that one tree. We couldn't, because nature in general doesn't grow fast enough. It's an extremely slow and almost unrecognisable process. And because none of us can see growth happening with our naked eye, we most certainly don't recognise that genetic development is also happening within us all, internally, but we are all evolving. This is why, in these next few chapters, we are going to discuss all of the millions of years of our different male and different female ancestors' emotional activities that have been so very different throughout each gender, but have influenced the development in certain areas in our brain, as you will discover shortly.